Something just broke, and the media won't tell you what it actually means. Right now, three separate fault lines are cracking open at the same time, and they're not unrelated. Trump's trade architecture, the tariff framework he spent years building as leverage against a world that had been quietly moving away from dollar dependency, is showing its first real structural fractures, not because the strategy was wrong, because the global chessboard no longer plays by the rules Washington wrote. The countries that were supposed to fold, they didn't. They called the bluff. Meanwhile, Iran isn't just a crisis, it's a pressure valve, and someone just twisted it. Every time American domestic politics gets loud, the Middle East gets louder. That's not coincidence, that's choreography. And then there's the hockey backlash, which sounds minor until you realize it's a cultural signal. When sports becomes a geopolitical flashpoint, you're no longer watching a game. You're watching a nation argue about what it believes in. This is the real briefing. Let's start with the trade situation, because this is where the story actually begins. Not in the headlines, but in the architecture underneath them. When Trump first rolled out his tariff strategy, the logic wasn't crazy. In fact, if you strip away the noise and the Twitter wars and the political theater, the core idea made sense. America had been running a trade deficit for decades. Manufacturing had hollowed out. The middle of the country had been quietly gutted, while coastal financial elites celebrated globalization as some kind of moral achievement. So the idea was simple: use tariffs as leverage, make it expensive to sell into the American market without playing fair, force renegotiation, bring jobs back, rebuild industrial capacity. That was the pitch, and for a certain segment of the American population, it resonated deeply because it was true. The problem wasn't the diagnosis, the problem was the assumption buried underneath the prescription. The assumption was that the rest of the world still needed America the way it did in 1990. That assumption is now being stress-tested in real time, and the results are not pretty. Because here's what changed while Washington was busy fighting culture wars and impeachment cycles. The world kept moving. China didn't just become a manufacturing hub, it became a technology competitor. The BRICS nations didn't just talk about alternatives to the dollar-based system, they started building them. The Global South didn't just grumble about Western economic condescension, they started voting with their trade agreements. And all of this happened quietly, incrementally, while American political attention was consumed by domestic drama. So when Trump's trade plans hit the real world in 2025, they didn't hit a world that was afraid. They hit a world that had been quietly preparing for exactly this moment. And you can see it in the numbers if you know where to look. The retaliatory posture from trading partners has been faster, more coordinated, and more strategically sophisticated than anyone in Washington seemed to anticipate. The European Union didn't blink the way it was supposed to. Canada of all places, pushed back with a kind of political backbone that genuinely surprised the White House. And China played it cool, deliberately, strategically cool, because Beijing understands something that Washington seems to keep forgetting. In a long game, patience is a weapon. You don't win by reacting loudly, you win by letting your opponent exhaust themselves while you consolidate your position, and that's exactly what's been happening. Now let's talk about what trade collapse actually means at the ground level, because this isn't abstract economics. This is about supply chains, about the cost of goods on American shelves, about the businesses that were supposed to benefit from protectionist policy and are now caught in a whipsaw of uncertainty. Small manufacturers who were genuinely excited about the possibility of a level playing field are now dealing with input costs that have gone up because the raw materials they need come from countries that are now retaliating. Farmers who were promised that tough trade posturing would open new markets are watching their export windows close in real time. And consumers, regular American families, are starting to feel it in ways that don't show up cleanly in the official inflation statistics, but absolutely show up at the grocery store and the hardware store and everywhere else people actually spend money. This is the part that the mainstream financial media refuses to discuss honestly, because discussing it honestly would require admitting something uncomfortable. The global economic order that America dominated for 70 years was not just the result of American ingenuity and hard work, though there was plenty of both. It was also the result of structural arrangements, military arrangements, financial arrangements, diplomatic arrangements that gave the United States extraordinary leverage over the rest of the world. And those arrangements are eroding, not overnight, not in a single dramatic collapse, but steadily, visibly in ways that compound over time. And tariffs, however aggressive, cannot reverse that erosion on their own. Because the erosion isn't about trade policy, it's about the underlying power dynamics that made American trade dominance possible in the first place. So when people say Trump's trade plans are collapsing, what they really mean is that the plan collided with geopolitical reality and geopolitical reality won. That's not a partisan statement. That's just an honest assessment of where things stand. And understanding that is actually the first step toward thinking clearly about what comes next. Now let's move to Iran, because this is where things get genuinely dangerous. The Iran situation is never just about Iran. That's the first thing you have to understand. Iran is a pressure point, a chronic, deliberately maintained pressure point in a much larger geopolitical game. And the players in that game are not just the United States and Iran. They include Israel, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, the Gulf states, Turkey, and a dozen other actors who all have specific interests in how the Iran file gets managed or mismanaged at any given moment. So when you see an Iran crisis explode in the headlines, the first question you should ask isn't, what did Iran do? The first question should be, who benefits from this being a crisis right now, at this particular moment? And right now the timing is interesting, because the United States is in a moment of significant domestic political vulnerability. The trade situation we just discussed is generating real economic anxiety. Trump's coalition, which was built on the promise of economic nationalism delivering tangible results, is starting to feel the friction between the promise and the reality. In moments like this, historically, and I mean this pattern goes back centuries, not just decades, in moments like this, foreign crises have a way of appearing that redirect attention and rally nationalist sentiment. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's political science, that's just how power works. What's happening with Iran right now specifically involves a combination of sanctions pressure, nuclear program developments, and proxy conflict escalation across the Middle East that has been building for months. The nuclear negotiations that seemed like they might produce some kind of framework, those have effectively stalled. And when nuclear negotiations stall with Iran, the military planning conversations in Washington and Tel Aviv get louder. That's not speculation. That's the established pattern. We've seen this movie before, and the script is disturbingly familiar. Here's what concerns me most about the current Iran moment. The United States is in a position where it has maximized its pressure tools. Sanctions are already at near maximum intensity, diplomatic channels are minimal, and military posturing is expensive and carries enormous escalation risk. So the question becomes, what's the actual endgame? What does a successful outcome look like? And honestly, when you look at the strategic landscape honestly, and without the filter of ideological wishful thinking, it's hard to see a clean exit. Iran has been under sanctions for over 40 years. The regime has survived, the population has suffered enormously, but the power structure has adapted. Economic isolation has not produced regime collapse. It has produced economic hardship and political consolidation, which is the opposite of the intended effect. And meanwhile, Iran's strategic position has actually improved in certain respects. Its relationship with Russia has deepened significantly through shared adversarial positioning against the West. Its relationship with China has formalized through energy agreements and diplomatic frameworks that root around American financial infrastructure. The Houthi situation in Yemen, which is directly connected to Iranian support networks, demonstrated that proxy warfare can disrupt global shipping lanes in ways that have real economic consequences for the entire world, including the United States and its allies. So the idea that maximum pressure automatically translates into Iranian capitulation, that idea has been tested and the evidence doesn't support it. This is not an argument for appeasing Iran or pretending the Iranian government is something other than what it is. The Iranian government has a documented record of regional destabilization, support for groups that have killed American soldiers, and domestic repression that should trouble anyone who cares about human rights and political freedom. All of that is true. But it is possible to acknowledge those truths and simultaneously recognize that the current American approach to Iran is not producing the outcomes it was designed to produce, and that the escalation path carries risks that are genuinely catastrophic. Because if military conflict with Iran begins in earnest, not proxy skirmishing, not drone exchanges, but actual direct military conflict, the regional consequences are not controllable. They are not containable by military planning documents and press conference optimism. The Middle East is a tinderbox, and the people who would suffer most are the ordinary people on every side who have nothing to do with the decisions being made by governments and power structures that treat human lives as acceptable collateral in geopolitical chess games. So when you see Iran crisis explode in your newsfeed, I want you to sit with that question. Who benefits? What's the timing? What are the actual strategic objectives? And is there any realistic path from here to a sustainable outcome that doesn't involve catastrophic violence? Those are the questions that serious people should be asking, and they are largely absent from the mainstream conversation. Now let's talk about hockey, because I know some of you think this is the small story, the sidebar, the human interest piece, the break from the heavy geopolitics. But I want to push back on that instinct, because the hockey backlash that's been generating heat recently is actually a window into something much larger and much more important about the American cultural and political moment. Here's what happened, for those who haven't been following it closely. The intersection of national identity, sports, and geopolitical friction, particularly around the US-Canada relationship in the context of Trump's tariff war and the inflammatory rhetoric about Canada being a potential 51st state, created a situation where hockey, a sport with deep cultural roots in both countries and a deeply intertwined professional league structure, became a flashpoint. Canadian fans booing the American national anthem, American commentators expressing outrage, social media exploding with takes that ranged from reasoned to unhinged, and underneath all of it, a genuine rupture in what had been one of the most stable and friendly bilateral relationships in the world. Now let's be clear about something. The United States and Canada share the longest undefended border in the world. They share the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world. Hundreds of thousands of families literally span the border. People with American parents and Canadian children, Canadian spouses and American careers, cross-border lives that have existed for generations. The relationship between these two countries is not just a trade agreement, it's a civilizational fabric. And when that fabric starts to show stress, when it shows up in sports arenas, in the thing that's supposed to be fun and unifying and apart from politics, that's a signal worth paying attention to. What the hockey backlash is really telling us is that the political choices being made at the top of the American power structure have real consequences for real relationships between real people. When you tell a country that has been your closest ally, your largest trading partner, your continental neighbor, your cultural cousin, when you tell that country that you're thinking about absorbing them, that their sovereignty is negotiable, that their economic relationship with you is a problem to be solved rather than a partnership to be honored, people feel that. They don't just file it away as political rhetoric, they feel it, and they start asking questions about identity and loyalty and what the relationship actually means. And this matters for the United States not just in terms of the immediate Canada relationship, but in terms of what it signals to every other country in the world that has been part of the American alliance system. Because the message being received, not just in Ottawa but in Brussels and Tokyo and Seoul and Canberra, is that American commitments are contingent, that American partnership is transactional, that the liberal international order that the United States spent 70 years building and underwriting and defending is now being weaponized against the very allies who were built to operate within it. That is a profound strategic message, and its long-term consequences are going to be far larger than any single trade dispute or any single diplomatic incident. The hockey booing is not about hockey, it's about trust, and trust, once damaged, does not repair itself quickly. It repairs itself through consistent, reliable, honorable behavior over time. And right now, the United States is not demonstrating that behavior toward its closest partners. That is a problem with long-term consequences that no tariff schedule and no military budget can fix. Let me bring all three of these threads together because they are connected, not superficially, not rhetorically, but structurally. What we are watching in real time is the stress testing of American power in a world that has changed more dramatically than American political culture has been willing to acknowledge. The trade plans are collapsing not because tariffs are inherently wrong, but because the world has developed alternatives to American economic dominance that didn't exist 20 years ago. The Iran crisis is exploding not because Iran has suddenly become more dangerous, but because American leverage in the Middle East, like American leverage everywhere, is more constrained than it used to be, and constrained power tends to escalate rather than negotiate. And the hockey backlash is exploding because the cultural and relational foundations of American global leadership are being strained by a political approach that treats alliances as liabilities and partners as adversaries. This is the pattern. This is the through line. And the reason it matters so much to understand it clearly is that the decisions being made right now, in trade policy, in Middle East strategy, in the management of alliance relationships, are going to have consequences that extend far beyond the current political cycle. The world being built right now is the world that Americans are going to be living in for decades, and building that world on a foundation of coercion and transactionalism and nostalgic assumptions about American dominance that no longer fully apply, that's a dangerous way to build. What would a smarter approach look like? It would start with honest assessment of where American power actually is today. Not where we wish it was, not where it was in 1990, but where it actually is in 2025. It would involve building trade relationships that are genuinely reciprocal rather than coercively one-sided. It would involve diplomatic engagement with adversaries that is realistic about what pressure can and cannot achieve. It would involve treating allies like allies, with respect, with reliability, with the understanding that trust is a strategic asset more valuable than any tariff revenue. And it would involve an honest national conversation about what kind of role America wants to play in a genuinely multipolar world, because that world is arriving whether Washington is ready for it or not. That's the real story underneath these three headlines, and I hope you're watching it clearly.